Okay, Rita, I'm recording now. Can you see?
Yes, Prophet is recording now.
Okay, one more minute. So we're being recorded just in case you don't say.
Should we stop sharing the computers?
It's not us who is sharing. It's Martin. So Martin wants to take us to the conclusions. Okay, so maybe let's start. People who join us will then just join us. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's come. We've got still more people who are joining us online. I can't see exactly, but we had about 60 people who registered to join us online. So we still have a big demand online. People, even when they're on campus, they want to join us from their comfort. So then, Risha, over to you. Then, yeah, I'll just leave it over to you. I'll only come in to coordinate, to take questions after both presentations. Yeah, so I think over to you then. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Prof. And as Prof warmly did, so just another warm welcome and good afternoon to everyone joining us for the seminar this afternoon. It's lovely to see a good turnout. And as Prof mentioned, we are expecting a lot more participants online, so we keenly await that. Before we begin, I also wanted to point out that we are recording the seminar and it will be made available on our ISER YouTube channel and our other social media platforms. So my name is Risha Khara and I'm the hosting chair for this afternoon. Before we begin, I will share a little background on the ISER. So we have 4 research areas, which include environmental resources management, human and economic development, cross-border trade in Africa, and lastly, today's topic, which looks at the politics linked to improving learning outcomes in South Africa, speaks to our 4th research area, which is skills development and education research. So it is my greatest pleasure to introduce Professor Martin Gustafsson, who is our speaker for today. Prof. Gustafsson is an education economist who produces research for the Department of Basic Education and is a member of the Research on Socioeconomic Policy Unit at the University of Stellenbosch. Prof. Gustafsson is also a research fellow with us at ICR and hails as a history teacher. His interests include development economics, the economics of education, education policy design, applied econometrics, and cross-country comparisons in education. So this is just to list a few. So I think it is very evident that Prof. Gustafsson is perfectly positioned to hold a discussion on topics linked to education in South Africa. However, specifically this afternoon, Prof. Gustafsson will be sharing insights on his research, which investigates the political economy and ideology of South Africa's educational development with a special focus on the acquisition of foundation skills in early grades. So this research is premised on South Africa continuing to lag behind various middle-income countries with weak foundational skills in reading and numeracy, especially among younger learners. These results have adverse long-range implications for skills in the labor market, poverty reduction, and social cohesion. Factors which factors which continue to hinder educational development in South Africa include poor quality teacher training at universities and weak education planning and capacity. So these are just a few of many factors which Prof. Gustafsson will shed light on during his presentation. Responding to the presentation is Mr. David Fryer, who is a political economist at Rhodes University. Mr. Fryer has the pleasure of teaching macroeconomics, microeconomics, and modules focused on the political economy and labor. So besides being a part of the Neil Agate Labour Studies unit, Mr. Fryer is also a co-editor on the Journal of Contemporary African Studies. And some of Mr. Fryer's research interests include education and skills systems, labor markets, social democracy, and multilateralism, and the role of macroeconomics and social policy. So, a massive heartfelt thank you to Prof. Gustafsson and Mr. Fryer for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. We anticipate a very thought-provoking and engaging discussion which unpacks the political and non-political factors which continue to hinder education development in the country. So lastly, just an outline of how the seminar will work. Prof. Gustafsson will present for about 25 minutes, which will be followed by a response from Mr. Fryer for about 10 minutes. Thereafter, we will have a time for question and comments. So for everyone that's joining us online, please post your questions in the chat box and throughout the discussion, and we will attend to them at the end of the presentation. And as Prof. Mbata mentioned, for everyone who has joined us in person at ISER, Prof. Mbata will be coordinating questions and discussions on that end, but all of this will be done after both of the presentations. So without further delay, it is my privilege to hand over to Prof. Gustafsson. Thank you.
Thank you, Risha. I presume you can hear me.
Yes, we
and
can.
You can see the presentation.
Yes, we
in
can.
full screen mode. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
everything looks perfect. Thank
Lovely,
you.
lovely. Thank you so much, Risha, and thank you for organizing, for taking part in the organization of this. Thanks to Nhlanhla Mbata for bringing this seminar together. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So I have, what, I think it's about 8 slides. And usually I my analytical work focuses on, draws a lot on data. This one does not. So it was quite different to the kind of work I usually do. And I'll try and explain to you why I think this is important, an important area of research. So let me just move to the next slide. So this is what I'm going to go through. I'm going to focus in particular on that 4th bullet, 3 sets of complaints, and then the 5th bullet, the polemics of accountability, because they're quite meaty sections. The other sections I can move through faster. I'm keeping my eye on the clock, and I look forward to questions and inputs, and of course David's response. Great to have a political economist responding to this. I have no idea what he's going to say, but it'll be interesting, I'm sure. So some background. RISE stands for Research into Systems of Education, and is an initiative that's been set up by people kind of closely associated with UNESCO, World Bank, those global bodies. Lant Pritchett, a well-known education economist, somewhat controversial, and entertaining, has been instrumental in setting up RISE. And one of the aims of RISE was to try and dig a bit deeper to understand why learning doesn't improve as easily as we would like it to improve. And the focus was developing countries. There you see the developing countries involved in some way in RISE. South Africa is not very deeply involved. There was a review of South Africa, but it didn't involve the kind of intensive intervention work that, for instance, India or Tanzania saw. And yeah, so I'll say a little bit about, you know, what I understand, what people understand with this term political economy in the context of education. But certainly, I mean, Rice was interested in applying political economy methods and principles to understanding this problem of why learning is so weak and improves so slowly in many developing countries. I mean, I don't think I need to, you know, explain to this audience that we do have a problem in countries like South Africa. In fact, South Africa's problem is arguably a lot worse than in many other middle-income countries. You would have probably heard about the fact that around 80% of our grade 4 learners can't read for meaning. There's a specific meaning behind that, but yeah, certainly reading levels are low in South Africa. You know, moving beyond that very shocking statistic from Pearls, even other research done in the education space looking at just very simple things like how many children can master the alphabet by the end of grade 1, by the end of grade 2, how many of them can read a sentence to an adult listening. Just statistics like that are really worrying and point to a problem with weak foundations, which then affect the entire educational trajectory of a lot of children in South Africa. So, yeah, incidentally, if you want to have a look at the full report, it's online. Nick, I should have mentioned, Nick Taylor is my co-author in this report. Please have a look at this, and please don't look at this, or you may want to look at it, but then look at it knowing that it's a summary that Rice produced, which neither Nick nor myself were particularly happy with, and it focuses on an earlier version of the report, and it's written by non-South Africans who at the time thought that everything in South Africa, everything that's wrong with South Africa has to do with corruption. So corruption is emphasized as the large factor in South Africa in education. Certainly corruption is one factor, but Nick and myself don't agree that you know, it deserves the kind of emphasis that you'll see in that summary. But that's, yeah, that's another story, and I'm sure many of you would be familiar with these kinds of problems. Your work gets summarized, and you have little control over some of these things. Now, this is very much for a non-South African audience. I'm not going to go through the first and second columns, but let me just do a bit of a recap on how the schooling sector has developed over the last 25 years or so. In the movement from the apartheid system to a democratic South Africa, a lot of the emphasis was understandably on the huge spending inequalities by race. The apartheid system was set up to treat races unequally in terms of spending and in terms of what actually happened in schools. So a lot of emphasis went into resourcing, and that was a huge problem that needed to be fixed, and it was fixed relatively successfully and in a relatively short space of time. I know education economists like Louise Crouch will say that, you know, outside of a country that's been at war, there's probably been no schooling system in the world that has experienced the kind of structural change in such a short space of time as we saw in South Africa in the 90s. So that was then followed by, parallel to this was the somewhat infamous outcomes-based education curriculum, which many of you would have perhaps been through at school if you're young enough. It was not a successful curriculum. There was pushback against it. It was said to be too vague, to give too much responsibility to individual teachers without being clear enough on exactly what needed to be taught and how. And this kind of reaction to OBE was cemented with what I call the SACMEC shock of 2005. That's roughly when the results of a Southern and Eastern African testing program called SACMEC started to become clear and filtered through the kind of policy circles in South Africa. And we realized, much to our surprise in a way, that our children perform worse than children in Kenya. And up to that point, despite the apartheid background, etc., there was a certain South African arrogance that kind of said that, well, as a relatively industrialized country, surely our children can read relatively well. And it was a shock. They actually don't. Much of the cause relates to how education and schooling happened under apartheid, but it was a shock that then provoked a number of reactions, including the massive annual national assessments program, which tested children across all grades, was a huge and cumbersome program, eventually stopped by not only unions, but a lot of education academics thought it needed to be stopped. And so that left a bit of a gap. There has been some corruption, for example, in the school appointment processes at school, although I would say, you know, the schooling system has been relatively immune from corruption. I think it's worth pointing out this point. Let me just get my, oh no, I don't have a pointer. This is PDF. But here, yeah, the Zuma years. Yes, the Zuma years are remembered for, yeah, the corruption scandals and so on. But I think it's worth remembering that at least during the first term of Zuma, especially with Trevor Manuel's presence in the presidency, there was a strengthening of planning systems. We got our national development plan for the first time, and there were a lot of systems, indicator systems were set up. And then, of course, came the pandemic. So that's the background. Now, when people understand political economy in education, in a way, there are two different understandings. There are political economists who want to bring their experience to bear on the schooling system and on schooling questions. And that's very important. And there's been a number of books, a lot of academic work in that area, especially beyond South Africa. But I would say a second kind of stream is people like myself who are from the education sector, who are not political economists, and in a sense want to draw from political economy, but also draw from theory around political discourse and bring that into the schooling issues. And that's a somewhat different thing to political economists going into education. And I suppose there was some kind of tension between these two sides. There are political narratives or paradigms, ideologies that clearly have an influence, especially in a sector as kind of intellectual as the schooling sector. You know, it's very different from the health sector, which has a very different kind of a more scientific, more measured set of outcomes, and where people react quite differently to service delivery. Now, so one of the things that myself and Nick did in this work for RICE was to unpack and kind of analyze formally things we have been familiar with and that people involved in education are quite familiar with, but which haven't really been documented or analyzed well. The objective being to understand how can one make sense of this, and how, given this context, what does one do to improve learning outcomes? So in a somewhat kind of, it's a bit of a caricature, this, but there's a lot of truth to it as well, I think. So we identified 3 different political narratives. First, professionalists, people who are often teachers, who have an education background. I'm a teacher myself, so it's a discourse, a narrative that I understand quite well. In terms of understanding, you know, it's logical, it's logic. The documentation, including the resolutions of Education International, are vital here. So Education International is the world's biggest federation of unions, and it's teacher unions. And South Africa has been quite influential. We've had a president who was South African, and in general, South Africa has been very involved in Education International. So that's the one. Bottom left, empiricists. So people that you would typically find in UNESCO, World Bank, or people who read documents from UNESCO and World Bank. Economists, education economists would be included there. So I mean, in many ways, that is my box now. And it would be the box, I think, of a few people in this meeting. And then I think those 2 are fairly well known. Then bottom right, this is a less known group, but hugely important. I coined the label rationalist steerers. Within the whole discourse around how governments in general, not just in education, but how governments in general should work better, there has emerged over the last 20 years a kind of school of thought that focuses very, very strongly on indicators and measurement, and many would say, well, isn't that the same as the economist? There are some key differences, which I'll explain in a moment. There's even a little kind of gospel, almost a gospel, called Deliverology, with a very gospel-like name, by Michael Barber. There's a lot of controversy around Michael Barber, but this is not something, you know, fringe. Michael Barber and people like him had a huge influence in the emergence of New Labour in the United Kingdom. During Trevor Manuel's time in the presidency, the first term of Zuma, this was a book that was doing the rounds. There was a huge interest in this as a way of improving government in South Africa. Now, what are the tensions? Because I've talked about the 3 little boxes. What are the tensions between these boxes? So remembering that a lot of what people understand as inaction, ambivalence, lack of leadership, etc., that people speak about in education often comes down to kind of some kind of stalemate and logjam in the disputes and narratives and counter narratives between these groups. So let's first look at the professionalists. Are often deeply suspicious of the economists and of measurement more generally, and will often think of these things as kind of being associated with some neoliberal agenda, which in turn could bring about privatization and casualization of employment. Casualization of employment is obviously something which teacher unions would absolutely oppose for obvious reasons. And you've probably come across some of this narrative. So essentially, they're saying that the economists, even these rationalist steerers, are not really interested in learning. They're not education people. They don't really see the real problem. And on the other hand, a lot of the empiricists will argue implicitly or explicitly that the professionalists are not really interested in learning, that they have a hidden agenda of enhancing the economic and social power of the profession. Remembering that teachers are a massive workforce, very powerful politically in South Africa, in many other democracies. And clearly, I mean, political power of the profession as a whole is very important. Political power often comes down to issues of salary and central bargaining and so on. And these empiricists will often argue that although the teachers have an education background, they are not sufficiently kind of aware of many of the issues around learning outcomes, exactly how reading develops, for example, in young children, how to measure reading, and things like incentives and accountability. Now, coming to the rationalist steerers, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, by the way. Yeah, okay. So the rationalist steerers would often react to the economists and the empiricists by saying that what these guys, the empiricists, are saying is too complex. There's too much about levels of incentives and psychology and human behavior and so on, and that it's not simple enough for government officials. And that what one needs is just very, very simple measures, but often lots of them. And this is what, for example, DPME, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, drives quite strongly a very indicator-focused kind of governance system. The economists will often push back and say that, well, these rationalist steerers don't understand sufficiently how incentives work. It's not simply about measurement. It's about other things as well. It's soft incentives. It's not just financial incentives. And in general, the tension between these two sides is huge. So, I mean, I work in much of the time in the Department of Basic Education, and there is considerable frustration over just template after template of indicators which must be populated, and then there's little sense of the reliability of these numbers. It's just pushing around huge quantities of numbers without a sufficient sense of what value does all of this add. So, all right, I'm using up my time a lot on this slide, but it was an important slide. So some of the observations I would say coming out of the analysis that we did was that there's very little guidance to guide planners, to guide academics on how to bring together these different things. The political strands, the data strands, and so on. I mean, just to illustrate if you look at, for example, our National Development Plan, it talks a lot about the stuff that economists would be familiar with, but it doesn't deal with the ideological concerns that unions bring up around the so-called neoliberalism of accountability, and when is accountability neoliberal, when is it not, and so on. And when are some of these terms abused, because that happens as well. Yeah, and the third bullet, there's not a lot of opinion survey data on what groups such as the public, teachers, journalists, officials believe to be the better obstacles to better learning. Clearly, all of those beliefs are rooted in some kind of ideology and in some political narrative. And if we're going to move forward, the argument that myself and Nick make is that one needs to understand that narrative. So a little bit on the polemics of accountability. So accountability, we argue, is probably at the heart of lots of the polemics, the disagreement within education, and it is where the stalemate often comes about. Nobody argues that there should not be accountability, but how accountability should be carried forward is subject to different understandings. For some, it's a question of individual teachers. For others, it's a question of school-centered, standardized assessment systems. So more a matter of keeping principals accountable, school principals accountable, as opposed to teachers. And if what we explain in our report is that a lot of the suspicion on the side of unions is to some extent justified, because some of the accountability pressure in the past has veered towards saying, let's hold individual teachers accountable. In fact, let's even pay teachers according to how well they teach the kids. That in principle might sound logical, but if you look at how schooling actually happens within a school, and that a school is a team of teachers, and it's difficult to link one teacher to specific improvements, it's very difficult to do. Whereas school-centered, holding school principals accountable is not easy, but it's certainly a lot more doable. So part of the polemic is just that one has been focusing on the wrong thing. Teacher accountability is probably something best not touched on too much, at least in terms of learning outcomes. Certainly the whole school can be held accountable. And the whole school is, of course, the accountability. The school principal is accountable for that. And right, I'm not going to go through this, but here we look at some of the existing systems in the school, and because there's certainly a lot that's already there in the schooling system, even at the primary level, remembering that a key problem in our schooling system is that if a primary school does not get its children to read, say by age 10, it's quite possible nobody will know about it, because teachers provide marks. There's very little external control or moderation of those marks. Parents, especially parents in poorer communities, trust educators who have university degrees to do the right thing. And often parents don't know how to gauge whether their children are on track when it comes to reading. Right. Does the human capacity exist in government to design an optimal mix of accountability rules and systems? That's a debatable point. I think part of the problem and the politics around this is that one often aims too high. So it's all very well to say that we're going to have a first world accountability and teacher support system, etc., but if the human capacity does not exist in government to design those things, and it's considerable capacity that one needs, one should probably not aim as high. And the annual national assessments is probably a good example of aiming too high, doing too much too soon, and then it's a case of 2 steps back, 4 steps back. 2 steps forward, 4 steps back. Just a couple of points on the broader ideological context. So, yeah, I mean, there's this argument that one will hear. For example, if you look at the resolutions of Education International, it almost says, not quite, but it almost says that standardized testing, in other words, for example, going into all schools, checking whether children can read, is a neoliberal plot. And there are examples of countries that are clearly not neoliberal that have done this kind of testing. So it's a bit difficult. It's a difficult argument to support. Is standardized testing inherently linked to privatization and casualization? Well, logically, no. I mean, you can test children and still guarantee the tenure of teachers and say that, look, if children are not reading, certain things happen, but nobody loses their job.
I'm sorry, Martin, just 5 minutes left, please.
Oh, I thought I had 1 minute left.
Okay, you can take 1
I'm
minute.
almost
That's
finished.
okay. Okay.
Okay. A further kind of political ideological factor to take into account is, of course, that UNESCO and the World Bank are not strong kind of explicit supporters of democracy because of who is in the United Nations, whereas Education International is. And that creates space, I think, for in conversations with the professionalists, with educators, to talk about the importance for democracy of a more explicit and systematic focus on learning outcomes. Incidentally, yeah, so in Education International represents almost all countries in the world. China is not there because China doesn't have unions in the sense that Education International would recognize unions. Cuba is not there, and several other democracies. South Africa is certainly there. I think 3 or 4 South African teacher unions are active in Education International. Conclusions regarding future research. I think this is the last slide. Yeah, I've already said what's in the first bullet, that, well, in a way I have, yeah. That, yeah, I think some of Rice's positions were a bit extreme. These are the people who funded the research. Insofar as it was, they were kind of hitting back at the whole capacity development movement in development economics. So they were saying, look, we've been building capacity for decades, nothing changes in education, we need to do things differently, we need to focus on the politics. And in a way, what Nick and I do is push back a bit and say, no, capacity building hasn't been done that well. There are deep capacity building gaps, and our national development plan certainly acknowledges that. We're many steps away from having the kind of, what's it? Not just developmental state. The national development plan likes talking about a professional developmental state. I think there's space for research into the struggles within bureaucracies between deliverologists and their detractors. Even if they don't go by the name of deliverology, there are very important disputes and conflicts within bureaucracies that produce stalemates of their own that are often outside the kind of the public view, but are extremely important and can cause kind of government malfunction. And then, yeah, again, that point, one needs to distinguish between the political economy of schooling, which is important, but also analysis of the politics of schooling. And, oh, no, this is the very last slide. So, yeah, deal more explicitly with the political realm. Yeah, what's quite striking is that a lot of government policies in South Africa and elsewhere say very little about the values that underpin them. And yet many critics, for example, teacher unions, use these values, or use a set of values all the time. So it reduces, it seems, the opportunities for good engagement between different groups in society if ideologies are not kind of taken out and kind of put on the table. And then, yeah, and then within the technical realm, Yeah, accountability solutions are partly political, but they're also partly technical. They're also about understanding things like how do you measure children's learning? How do you measure the socioeconomic background of learners and the contexts of schools? Because one has to gauge what happens in a school relative to the kind of disadvantage that the community has. We have these quintiles in the schooling system, which are not very popular, but probably do a fairly good job of it. So those are some of the technical things that technical issues. So the challenges are technical, the challenges are political. Thank you, Risha.
Thank you so much, Martin. I think everyone would agree it was definitely very topical, very, very interesting, very much needed. I think also just fleshing out the importance of accountability. And then it's also, and if we look at it at a grassroots level, it's linked to trust and parents trusting teachers and the dynamics around that. So thank you for that. But I'm sure we'll discuss more about this. We'll discuss more of this after David's presentation. David, are you ready? Just a quick mention.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Is my presentation good?
Yes, I can hear
Go to the
you.
next page.
Your presentation is good. Before you
Right.
before you begin, David, I just also wanted to remind our participants online that if you have any burning questions, and I'm sure that you do after that presentation, please pop them into the chat box and we will address them once David has presented. Thank you, David. It's over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Martin and everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, they can hear
Great.
you.
Yes, we can.
So the point of departure that I want to take is the idea of South Africa being exceptional, and we see, exceptionally bad educational outcomes, right? And just to emphasize that it's the whole system. So we see the best students are worse than the middle students, that whole thing. And the kind of narratives that we see about that are, one, it's a legacy, and it's a problem of resources, and we've done as well as we can, right? Versus a bad government approach, right? And obviously the bad government approach isn't just a South African thing. You go to the best country in the world and the people they will complain about how bad the government. It's hardwired into people to be discontented. But in South Africa, there's a lot more legitimacy there than if you're in Ireland or somewhere where there aren't potholes, right? But it's definitely, those are the two narratives that dominate, right? So I think what the approach that Martin and Nick have tried to say is, let's have a more nuanced story about the details of the choices that were made and the politics of those choices. And by politics here, we mean collective choices, right? Made by stakeholders, informed or legitimized, because sometimes we can't assume goodwill, that there's this stated social purpose is the actual set social purpose, right? By ideological narratives. And the ideological narratives they identified are empiricist, rational steering, and professionalist. And I think in a nutshell, what the paper is arguing is that this quote here, there has been little written about ideological narratives and how they influence education. And even if you look beyond the narratives themselves, you look for things like theory of change, right, which you would expect to see, right, where you have goals, and and you'd expect to see some scaffolding of those goals. How are we going to get from A to B? But you don't find a lot, and I think this is true. So even though people in the debates recognize how important these ideological narratives are, right? And this is the problem, right? So we're making political choices, but the basis of the choices is confused, right? Because we've got the debate that is unresolved. and got a couple of the cause of this and the effect. And I think it's quite nice, maybe cheeky to say that on page 51, you talk about your concerns about political economy discourse. And I would say that your concerns are evident in your paper as well. Firstly, that, so let me just do the cause and effect story, right? So the cause of this neglect of the big debates was a sense of urgency, right? South Africa got, who wants to talk about epistemology when the schools are falling down? Right? The urgent issues are the ones that are right in our face. Eh? And also, really importantly, and it's tangentially a lot in this paper, is the fetishization of what we call an evidence-based or, evidence, what is it? Evidence, driven approaches to policy, right? And of course, it's like empirical saying, who would contest that evidence is important? Nobody, right? But the problem is that whether it's qualitative or quantitative work, if this is at the expense of deeper reflection, at the kind of epistemological, where people are locating their ideas within broader traditions, or the ontological level about values, and then it becomes problematic, and we get into what has been criticized with the rational theorist, where you have data for its own sake. Or economists whose idea of a good journal article is beating around the bush a bit and then getting into the econometrics, the number crunching is all that matters, right? Often meaningless, right? Meaningless. So, and often the statistics, the very statistics that we're working with themselves are quite, we've taken them, but look, what is the unemployment rate? What is the poverty rate, right? If we just have a poverty rate and it's $1 a day, so you get that. And with the with the qualitative research as well, we often get anecdotalism, right? And too many different points of view. So if you lack the layer that is supposed to pull these things together, and doesn't have to be a synthesis, we're not looking for single, but a recognition of pluralism and debate, rather than people being able to retreat into their igloos. So the effect of this was a lack of reflexivity in debates, with the result and the kind of concerns that I mentioned, confusion, where we've got lots of jargon and lots of philosophical debates, and then you've got these pushed onto educators, and educators who don't know whether that's an outcome or a aim or a goal, and you're trying to change your teaching to fit this weird philosophy that's come. So, and all sorts of, a lot of confusion about the deeper debate. So again, in the paper, I think it's not unresolved in the paper what these big narratives you're talking about are. So I'll focus on empiricism, for example. And you've kind of associated empiricism with economists, and particularly with human capital theory, right? And again, in the paper, we seem to also acknowledge that economists are in the Treasury, right? And the Treasury are pushing a completely different agenda, which is a budget agenda. And then we've got accountants as well. So we've got, so I think that there's a lot of unpacking that can be done with your categories. The second really important thing, and again, is that when you don't have a concern with methodology, you're going to miss things out. So economists famously run regressions with missing variables. Why do they have the missing ball? The data wasn't available. So that just isn't important because you didn't have data for it often. So we can see, why do things get excluded? And this is the gist of the paper. Certain things just get excluded and are less important, or treated less important. They're not elevated in debates. And because you've got lots of stakeholders, and either the stakeholders are agreeing to kind of that they don't disagree about them, like decentralization of schools, right? for different reasons, right? Or the people who are influenced by those things are not powerful, right? So just, preschool children don't have trade unions, right? So their concerns are not going to be elevated, right? Okay. So then what we get is, because of the different the unresolved ideological positions, right? We do get the silos and the epistemic fragmentation. And I think it's quite interesting in the paper, you talk about the kind of very distinct distinction between educationalists and economists, right? Very distinct. And how also then we have accountants coming in there, with the accountabilities, and in measuring everything. Okay. And how consequential the fact that you've got different unresolved, and not even in a pluralistic way, though, right? Just different people with different frameworks trying to talk to each other. So what we're getting from this is an inability to understand and manage complexity in the system. And you talked about, for example, simplifying models, that we must now look at Singapore or Finland as a way, or suddenly we have, paperless classrooms. The fourth industrial revolution is a panacea for all of our problems. So we do get not only this confusion is associated with policy instability, right? And frequent changes in direction of policy, which demoralizes the whole structure. Now, I think in particular, your focus is on, you call it a catalytic focus on planning, right? Because planning is vitally important. It's planning is what links those goals we have in the National Development Plan, which is not a plan, it's a set of goals, right? And where we are now, the theory of change, of how we're going to get to where we want to, right? And planning, as you've documented, there are 10 plans, all the different education departments, plus the national one.
Sorry,
and then the
David.
other one.
Sorry,
Sorry?
David, just about 2 to 3 minutes left.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is my last slide. Yeah. The other one is accountability of primary schools, right? Why accountability of primary schools? Well, I'll get into it in more detail, but in South Africa, we have a one exam system, matric. So accountability is there, and accountability elsewhere is trying to make a dog walk on its hind legs, right? And I think that's what we observe, right? And who do you make accountable? Do you make the teachers accountable? Do you make the schools accountable? Do you make the children accountable? Do you make the parents accountable, right? And the second part of the paper, I think, deals with when we talked about the exclusions. The main exclusion was that learning, that the crisis in South Africa is about learning or curriculum, right? It's about what's happening, learning. And we can also say not just learning in the classroom, right? It pervades the rest of the education system, the teaching and learning crisis, but also the labor market. Okay? So the trade unions used to do worker education. That's gone by the wayside. So the in-service learning has gone. It pervades planning. And I think a very interesting read in the end is how the planners themselves, right? They're not capacitated, right? And because they're not capacitated, they're unable to manage the difficult political position they're in, where they have to deal with, kind of changes in policy, politicians wanting more than is possible, and good planners. Like I remember when outcomes-based and various other things, some departments just ignored that stuff, knowing that it would go away in a couple of years, right? Others spent resources developing programs and things like that. So the good planners kind of manage their politicians, right? That's a theme that's throughout the paper. Okay, so anyway, just I'm running out of time. So, and this problem of learning rooted very much at the foundation level, but pervading the system. And more broadly, I think the diagnosis is that South Africa has replaced the apartheid system of education without, well, it hasn't. So we had school inspectors. We don't have school inspectors anymore. What do we have? We had one exam at the end. We still got one exam at the end. And it's very interesting to look at other countries, like the East Asia. What do? They're very assessment intensive, right? They're very summative assessment. They have lots of exams, very meritocratic. Or Scandinavian countries that are much more formative assessment and support teachers and support children, right? But just to finish, right, the lesson is, well, yes, what are the potential starting points for fixing the system? And we can think from your paper, the things you've highlighted. Teacher training is a major one that you highlight, right? Teacher training at universities. But I think at a level back, we have to think about how learning is embedded in society. And of course, that it does include accountability, standardized testing where appropriate, governance, all of those things. But critically, it depends on re-embedding systems in civil society, not just teachers and parents, but also civil society organizations. Okay. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much for that response, David. I definitely think it was well thought out, but you also raised various critical questions, which I think Martin would address as we go along in the discussion. So we've got a lot of chat going on in the chat box, and so lots of questions that have been posed. But I think what we'll do is we will try to take a round of questions from in the room, and then we will move to online questions. So Prof. Mbata, if you're ready, and please would you coordinate maybe like 2 or 3 questions from the room, which Martin and David can respond to, and then we will jump to the questions online. Prof. Mbata?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you, David. Thank you, Martin. Do you want, I know that I've sent you questions to post online. Do you think of those questions as online questions, or are you going to take those online?
I can take them online, Prof, but if you would like to pose them yourself, you can go ahead, then we will strike them off as being in-person questions. Yeah.
Let's take 3 questions then, and then mine will be last.
Okay, not a problem. Go ahead.
From
the
any
room.
hand. Okay, so all right, I'll start with mine. I just want to see it there.
So your first one's all the way on the top.
All the way on the top. Sorry, I forgot which one was the first one.
There we go. Here we go.
Okay.
Yes.
So my understanding is that the reason why the honors was stopped was because of the pushback from unions, in particular SATU, and especially because of the explicit nature in which the honors would show how some teachers could not even pass some of the tests that were given to the learners. And I think that was embarrassing to members. But then the official reason given was that the administration of the test itself was cumbersome. So do the authors think that honors would have made a positive impact if they continued after 2014? And how big an impact this would have had? I know you talk about the usefulness of these measures later on, but I don't know, it doesn't come across from the presentation that you emphasize enough that unions pushing back and the politics around how we got rid of the honors. Maybe because you are in the government, or maybe because you are not. You are muted.
Shall I? Okay, so I'll answer questions one by one.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yes, if
Another
there's
question
any other question
from the room?
in the room.
Yes, go ahead.
Like,
Just yes.
um, first of all, thank you for the chat, the conversation that's been going on. I just wanted to bring forward the role that language plays as well in education, because if you look at the tests that have been standardized, especially with the NSC in grade 12, they're written in English and Afrikaans. And that kind of linguistic exclusion really does play a role in the foundation phase, because what's happening is that students tend to learn in a language that isn't their first language. So they go home and they're fully immersed in their first language, be it like Zulu or Xhosa, Venda, etc. But then in a school setting, they're expected to understand the work in English or in Afrikaans, or something that's completely disconnected from the language that they're immersed within from childhood. So with the statistic you brought up, that 80% of children in grade 4 can't read for meaning, I'd just like to know how much of the reason for that is actually linguistic and not necessarily them not understanding the content of that word.
Okay,
Thank
so I
you.
think from the room, those are the two questions that we have. Maybe the one question I can pose for David is you talk about the usefulness of methodologies into understanding these complex systems, and that, I mean, some most of the economics would sort of like go one way, and Martin talks about how we're not confronting enough ideologies. So maybe to you, what would be the best or more capable methodologies of understanding complex systems that, like we have of this education system, which is embedded in a society that's trying to define its national identity? Sorry, it's a bit too much, but that, yeah.
Just allow time to think about it.
Okay. All right. That's it from the floor then, from us, this side, Risha.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Mbata. Martin, you can go ahead and respond, and then we'll give David a time to respond as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, let me respond to three questions. Well, on 3 points. The first being, yeah, I mean, thanks, David. I think, I mean, I learned a bit just listening to you, because it's always useful to get that kind of reflection from somebody who's new to this and who's coming from a different area. I mean, I have a few points that where I would ideally like to respond, but let me not take too much time. So I just want to respond on one point, and that is, to create or a little bit of hope. Yes, things are complex in education, but let's not overstate the difficulty and the complexity that we face. I mean, I would say that schooling is less complex than health, for example. Health deals with immensely complex issues around private versus public, funding, delivery. In education, virtually everyone agrees that the public sector must play a huge role. Everyone, from the World Bank to everyone. So there is quite a lot of unity of purpose in education, despite all of this kind of wrangling around different terms, languages, ideologies, and so on. And on a very kind of practical note, I think that we are slowly recovering from the ANA shock, and I'll get to the ANA question in a moment. If you look at provinces such as Gauteng, so Gauteng has started kind of sending district officials to schools. They'll take a random sample of kids. They'll just get those kids to read. It's not intrusive. It's quite kind of low stakes, but it does have an influence on the conversation that the administration has with the school if they discover that kids can't read. And just that kind of point of departure, I think, is important, and in some ways may prove more useful than the original ANA. Ntantla, on your ANA question, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are under the impression that ANA was halted by unions because the unions, in particular SATU, don't like transparency. They don't want to be shown up. They don't want teacher performance to be under the spotlight. There's a bit of that, but it is more complex. So what was interesting about ANA was that even university-based education academics did not like ANA, and there were some good reasons for it. It was, above all, those results were not comparable properly, sufficiently from one year to the next. So it was easy to cheat. Schools that were perhaps not improving appeared to be improving on paper and vice versa. And that just creates chaos. I mean, when you have a massive system like that is not giving you accurate information, and people start using the information in unregulated ways. Let's remember, ANA had no policy, no clear policy on what is this thing going to achieve. So you had people doing all sorts of things. I mean, in Limpopo, there's anecdotal evidence of district directors lining up school principals and saying, these are your results, explain, so kind of Stalinist type confession camp. And these things, yeah, you can understand why the system didn't like this. I think it was a case of just overestimating what can be done. And it comes back to, I think, David's point about kind of fetishizing certain things. Sometimes it's evidence, sometimes it's systems. We're told that we must have a good, robust system. And then overnight, we want to create something that Singapore developed over 40 years. So, yeah, I mean, my take would be, I wish ANA had been fixed rather than stopped. But the decision was taken to stop it. But I think there's like green shoots starting to emerge of other ways in which kind of softer accountability can take place, which is not as technically complex, which is useful, and which really concentrates on what matters, such as the reading of children. And then the question, I didn't get the name, but the very interesting question and a common question about language. And here, yeah, this 80% of children can't read for meaning, that is from Pearls, and that is testing in home language. So what is very clear from the evidence, and my colleague Nompumelelo Mokhohlwane from the Department of Basic Education, she's done brilliant research into this, into languages in the early grades. And specifically the issue of language policy. So I mean, it's really important to remember that children, it's not just that they're having problems reading in English. The reading is not acquired properly even in the home language in the first 3 years, and that then has knock-on effects on English as used in the rest of the system. The language debates are fascinating, and one of the things my colleague Mpumi has done is compared, for example, what was done with Afrikaans over 60 or so years in South Africa. How does it compare to the policy debates around languages in South Africa? Getting back to this issue of political narratives, I think when it comes to our 11 official languages, what's important is to distinguish between, on the one hand, how language issues can complicate learning in schools, and a separate issue of empowering African languages in particular for their own sake, because it's a thing of nation building, etc. And if one conflates those two issues too much, I think that it can easily become confusing. Both are important, but I think it's often useful to keep them to some extent apart, because there are different dynamics on the two sides. That would be my take.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that response, Martin. David, would you like to respond to Prof. Mbata's question?
Yeah, thank you,
comment.
Martin, for taking so long, which gave me enough time to think about that rather challenging question, because it was I was at a loss when you first asked me. But I think it's very what you said about education is kind of, you know, we have lots of we all agrees, don't we? And then yet we can't do it. So where's the slippage? Huh? Sorry. Switch that off. Okay. And I think that what we agree on is that, you know, that it should be focused on the child, right? There should be learning. We should have a focus on teaching and learning. What becomes so difficult is the planning, right? It's the administration, and it's the two aspects of planning that make it hard are the technical, you know, are you going to deliver a system? But the real compounding factor is the politics of it, right? And I think throughout your paper, you're talking about the difference between relatively easy things, you know, like supporting, you know, we can all agree we want to support, right? But when it comes to the critical question of discipline, right? So when you look at development, the development state, that, you know, it's easy to give subsidized industries, right? But when you want them to do things that they're not naturally wanting to do, that's when it becomes hard. And the content that I think so that adds a layer of complexity to planning, right? And I think that's the planning is the critical element, right? Once we've recognized what we want to do, why are we not doing is because there's slippage in the system of delivery. So how do we do this, right? And I think it starts with good comparative analysis, right? You know, moving away from, oh, South Africa is exceptional and we must reinvent the wheel ourselves, to saying, oh, well, let's be Finland or let's be Singapore. And rather thinking about, I think how do we analyze what makes education systems work and not work critically at the planning level? So that would be my point. I know, and I think that is fundamentally not going to be done within any disciplinary silo. So to take your point, right? I think it's a implicitly, inherently interdisciplinary endeavor, which is very difficult because you have a very grounded approach looking at countries, but is bringing, you know, very interesting narrative histories of those countries about comparative education systems together. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
Sure. Thank you. No, great. Maybe, Risha, we must then move online.
Yes.
If we've got time, we can come back to the. I see there's lots of questions online, and then if we've got
Yes.
time, we can come back to the floor again.
Okay,
Over to
no,
you.
wonderful. But thank you for those responses, Martin and David. So we have, as Professor Mbata mentioned, we have lots of questions online. So I'm going to jump into the first one. It's from VJ Reddy. She says, Martin, you refer to 3 sets of complaints. Where does the characterization that the state is weak and fragile and unable to set up systems to improve education fits in? Okay, so that's the first one. I'm going to go through 2 more and then give you some time to respond, Martin. The second one is from Ureta, who is from the education faculty at Rhodes. She said that she was hoping that you would share the research showing that poor teacher education is a key contributing factor to poor learning outcomes. And then I'm going to skip Professor Mbata's question and I'm going to go to another sort of follow-up from Kate. So this is a follow-on from Ureta. There seems to be a great deal of apathy among university students who are studying to become teachers. In some cases, I wonder if it stems from the belief that studying to be a teacher is easier than some other degrees. How do we address this problem? So that's 3 comments and questions that if you're ready to respond to them, Martin, you can go ahead.
Okay. On VJ's question, the weak state. Yeah. First, one needs to ask, how weak is our state? And, you know, I have different feelings on different days, depending on what meetings I attended, who I saw. But all states, certainly in developing countries, there are deep weaknesses. So again, I mean, let's not overstate how, you know, our exceptionalism. At the same time, we have to draw a link between our capacity problems in the state and the the problems we have in the schooling system. I mean, one of the reasons we don't have a lot of kind of highly skilled statisticians or planners coming into government is because the schooling system is not producing enough people coming out with those skills. I've been looking recently at mathematics outcomes from grade 12, comparing it to what universities are demanding every year, and the schooling system undersupplies what is needed even for universities, and yet we know universities are undersupplying what the economy and what the state needs. So there's a whole kind of supply chain. So in a way, Vijay, to answer your question, that is the link. I mean, we need to fix schooling because we need to fix the economy, but a stronger state, a more capable state, depends on our young people having the necessary skills and developing skills amongst people who are older and already in the system. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. On the matter of teacher quality, this is something that my co-author Nick would have focused very strongly on. He's kind of more knowledgeable and passionate about this than I am. He's worked more closely with the issues of teacher training. I think what's interesting in evidence that's been emerging in recent years is, firstly, that an absolute gap is clearly that primary school teachers are not properly equipped, despite having 4 years of university training. They're not properly equipped to teach reading. This is not just a problem in South Africa. There's new evidence emerging about the science of reading, how one does reading. People who are familiar with this field will tell you about the reading wars that go on, the phonics versus the whole language approach, etc. There again, there are these ideological narratives around the methodologies relating to reading, but it's becoming a lot clearer now what works and what doesn't. And I mean, if Nick was here, he'd probably argue more passionately than myself that a lot of the time a teacher training is a liberal arts education. It doesn't really teach you techniques of pedagogy. But at the same time, I mean, these are problems that many developing countries face. I think what is worth acknowledging is that although the shift from college-based to university-based training for all teachers was not terribly popular, there is very clear evidence that younger teachers are teaching kids better than older teachers. There seem to be absolute benefits associated with having a university-based training as opposed to the old college training that was offered under apartheid. So there has been some improvement, but there's still more that needs to be done. And then on again, the teacher training issue, and this is a political economy question. Who do we want as teachers? One often hears this argument that we need to raise the caliber of young people who choose education as their field of study. There's evidence that education students are like at the bottom of the rankings on average compared to engineering, law, etc., when it comes to their matric results. Maths results, for example. Their maths results are quite weak, and these are going to be maths teachers. The problem with the argument that we need to, somehow magically raise the caliber of teachers, is that the only way to really do that is to pay teachers twice as much as they currently get. It's economically not viable. And I saw there was a question about teacher pay. It's a separate issue that it's very interesting. But young people make rational choices when they decide what to study at a university, and they are influenced by admission criteria, etc., etc. I think that the best way of making sure that we have better teachers in future is just to raise the quality of people coming out of matric, because then you're still going to get the people roughly in that same segment of the distribution becoming teachers. But if the entire distribution has moved up, you are still going to get better teachers. But to think that we're going to get people who would otherwise choose to become engineers to switch and become teachers is I think a bit romantic on the whole. Obviously, there are individual exceptions, but I don't think it's an economically informed argument. People just don't behave that way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Martin. Prof. Mbata, we have a lot more questions on the online platform. So if there are no questions from in the room, I'm going to continue with the questions from online.
Okay, let me just hear
sound?
from the room. All right, let me hear from the room. Any burning question, Jamie? Yes.
I'm just wondering if there isn't a need to, from my friends that have children, it seems these days kids are teaching themselves a lot from TV and social media, and even watching YouTube videos. So I think that there might be a need to think about the educational content that is available to children.
Okay.
Because the self-learning seems to be quite a lot that's in the way that's driving children's their day-to-day learning.
Okay. Yeah, so that's the one question there. Maybe just to add, because this is going to be the last round now, we're just going to go online and we're done. To David and Martin. Martin talks a lot about political ideologies, in the background. Some of them are really hidden, are put, under the table in discussions. David goes on and talks about values. And in my mind, I think there's a connection between the two, or if the two are not the same thing. But if there is a tendency to hide these values and to hide these ideologies, I'm very curious as to why would they be hidden? If values are so important in guiding us identify a vision to which then the planning that, David, you talk about needs to be driven by or directed by. So to me, that seems to be a worrying thing, that what needs to be there to guide us is what everybody is putting under and I don't understand why and what we should do about that. Okay, so that's my question from last questions from the floor.
Okay, thank you. I think if possible, can I give Martin and David just like a minute each to respond, and then we will go through all of the questions online, one last response, and then I think we'd reached our time limit. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, Martin, go ahead, and also just 1 minute response from Martin and David, if possible. I know it's difficult, but if possible.
Okay, Jamie's question about technology, that's a whole kind of field of its own. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that within in the political narrative in South Africa currently, fourth industrial revolution is hugely influential. There's a presidential commission on fourth industrial revolution. I think there's a lot of kind of hot air, uninformed hot air around fourth industrial revolution. A lot of people don't really know what it's about, don't understand its roots in the World Economic Forum and why UNESCO and the World Bank won't touch the term. So there's a lot of controversy around this term. I think there's it's kind of, there's room for a PhD on the fourth industrial revolution and how it's understood in South Africa, but also several other countries. Yeah, that's what I want to say about technology. And then, Nhlanhla, your question around why are these values hidden, that is absolutely important. And I don't think I have a coherent answer right now. I don't think we address this properly in the paper, and I don't know if one can actually do this without, you know, some very serious kind of interviewing and field a focus group and so on. But perhaps some of the answer would lie in the contradictions that we see in the schooling system, in society. Just one example, all right? So teachers will often think of themselves as, yeah, workers. A lot of the political language around teacher unions is teachers are workers. But then if you look at where teachers are sitting in the wage distribution in South Africa, they're very, very far, they're very close to the top. They're not at the top, but they are pretty near the top, which is a contradiction. And when you have contradictions like this, perhaps you don't want to hang out all your dirty washing. So, you know, these things are often not discussed.
Thank you,
David?
Martin.
Okay.
David.
Yeah. So I think also there are values that we seem to espouse or pretend that we all, we all adhere to, but actually within the schooling system, patriarchy, traditionalism, conservatism are rampant, within the country, right? So we see, with discipline of kids. So I think the activists have pushed the needle, right? So that we now are focusing on early learning. But in your paper, for example, you talk about how parents don't value those things, right? So there's parents value things that they can see, like getting a matric, or so there's less. I think the different perceptions are very important that people have. And you also talk in your paper very interestingly about trying to bring an expert into the room to kind of resolve certain things, and how that's pushed back, not least by politicians who see that as undermining their power. So I think, in South Africa, we have the Constitution at the center with the progressive realization of rights, right? We haven't even figured out what that means, right? Because we've got, like, as you mentioned in your paper, the EFF saying every school must have a swimming pool, right? So you've got this unrealistic expectations, and then it's meeting then impossibility of delivery and all the unresolved kind of cultural differences. Yeah, so to me, the national identity in South Africa is a weird thing. We're not, and I suppose it's the same everywhere. We're certainly not social democratic, are we?
Okay, over to you,
Thanks.
Risha.
Yes, thank you, Prof.
Thank you so much.
Okay, cool. So thank you for that response, David. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to cover 4 questions, and let's see how many I have left. So my next question is from Yureta. Our students in education are starting to research the interplay between policy and its enactment in the classroom. How do teachers work with the affordances and the flaws of the policy? Perhaps a more human form of accountability versus the deliverology paradigm, lovely term, could assist us here. Because no policy will be perfect, whether it's ideologically based, whether its ideological base has been clearly articulated or not. So our next one is from Thomas. Thank you, Martin, for summarizing an awful lot of critical points in such a short time. which helps a great deal. My question here is about the theory you wish to apply to the state. Many political economists and sociologists have made the state a primary focus for analyzing education, economy, political relations. Typically, for example, looking at the tensions between skills, employers, profits, workers, and legitimacy hegemony. Most political economy models of educational change have behind them a theory of the functioning of government or the theory of the state. My question in a nutshell, if you had to tell us about the theory of the state that you feel must lie behind your work here, what does it look like? Another question or observation from Kate. I grew up with OBE and then switched to CAPS. Looking at what IP students are learning today, I feel that my quality of education was much poorer. How then do I close that gap as a lecturer teaching potential IP students? From my experience, teachers were poorly prepared for the change in curriculum. Do teachers not have a legitimate reason to demand better salaries, teaching resources, etc.? Is it really about looking for political clout, or is it more about improving the teaching environment for learners? So there's about 4 more, I think. So or more than 4. So I think I'll stop there, Martin. And if you'd like to respond, and then maybe I can do one final round of questions.
Okay. Yeah, I wrote down 3, but maybe I've collapsed 2 of them. So yeah, Eureka's point about exploring kind of more human-centered, I presume, accountability, monitoring. That is certainly something that should be emphasized. However, one must remember that when you reach a certain scale, such as a schooling system like ours, you do need to have certain kind of systems which involve kind of anonymity. It's large, it looks kind of, it's a bit intimidating, but we need the system. So an example that I refer to where we got things wrong in our paper is there's a section in the South African Schools Act which requires the provincial head of the education department to receive reports from every school on how children are proceeding academically, examine those reports, go back to the school, look at, I mean, essentially, it's a system that could work in Seychelles, which has 20 schools. But if you're looking at a province with 4,000 schools, you have to think systems. And even if at a district level, there's a certain kind of need for systems. So yeah, balancing, you know, more personal interactions with more systemic bureaucratic elements is part of the challenge. The question on the theory of the state, it's a very important question. I mean, the theory of the state that underlies the work we're doing, to some extent, I think we're explicit, is basically, yeah, the social, kind of a social democrat, certainly a democratic state, certainly a law-abiding state, certainly a state which is not kind of populist or, you know, driven by, you know, extreme nationalism and things like that. You know, we're not assuming, for example, a Marxist-Leninist state. That would have a very different kind of, that would be a very different kind of underpinning. And, you know, whatever you think about communism, one thing that's worth noting is that communist countries have exceptionally good learning outcomes. Communist countries were very bad at innovating technically and so on, but they did a fairly good job of schooling young people in fairly standard ways. And Vietnam, China are bearing the fruits of things that happened in the 1950s and 60s in schooling. And then there was a question about teachers' pay. Yeah, pay versus environment. This links up to the earlier question around who chooses teaching. I should correct myself. One probably wouldn't have to double the pay of teachers in order to attract kind of people with better matric scores into teaching. However, apart from pay, there are conditions of service. The conditions of the working conditions of teachers are complex. They have quite long holidays, but it's a very tough job in ways that, sitting at a drawing desk in an architect's office is not. And that's part of what incentivizes or disincentivizes people from going into education. And one needs to balance the two, pay and the conditions, the working conditions of teachers. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. So we are definitely going a bit over time, so please bear with us and thank you for your understanding. Martin, so we have a few more comments and questions. The next one is from Nikki Hayes. Thanks, Martin. I'm concerned about your suggestion of the accountability resting on principals as representatives of the school. In the Eastern Cape, accountability is already used by the Eastern Cape Department of Education as a verb with which to constantly flagellate principals who are then caught in a vice between the union and the department. And the department is not necessarily always that distinguishable from the union. I imagine that further focus on the principal accountability will, rather than cause systemic improvement, result in a shortage of people willing to be principals. Another question from Ureta, or maybe just an observation. A recent Department
So,
of...
Risha,
Yes,
can you
Prof?
skip us who've already asked and maybe go to Sam and the people who have not
Okay,
asked?
sure. Not a problem. I'll do it so. Okay, then we have another question from Sam. Looking at the division between professionalist, imperialist, rationalist, theorist, do you have a more concrete sense of which state civil society group falls into which camp? You already offered some indication, but I was especially uncertain about the rationalist theorists. Okay. Then we have another question from Zen Corsi. Thank you, Martin, for your presentation. Is your study planning or are you aware of on perhaps looking at the impact of early learning in any way? You mentioned the challenges faced at primary level. Research around early learning is that a child's brain between the ages of 3 to 5 develops at a rate so high that that is a window of opportunity to shape the trajectory of a child's development and foundation. In essence, should we be starting with, and that's government, parents, and caregivers involved, education at that level? With such a critical foundation, perhaps this will have effects on the child's school readiness, encouraging parents also at this time to take part in the education of their child. I agree that too much responsibility is put on teachers only, which shouldn't be the case. Thank you. Okay, and then I'll do one more or two more. So I've...
Nikki, have we done Nikki?
Yes, we've done Nikki. So
Okay.
we've done everyone that has responded already.
Okay.
So now I'm going to start to overlap. Yeah. So this would be just following the question that I just spoke of. I would argue that the pandemic exposed the lack of accountability of parents in terms of reinforcing what is taught in the classroom. This is naturally at least partly a resource and level of parent education issue, but I do think that there needs to be more parental oversight, accountability in children's education. I'm going to go to Nikki. Anna's were also just a supreme irritation to teachers, as it was an immense amount of marking that one then couldn't use as part of school-based assessment. It was ill-conceived. Okay, I'm looking for a question. Okay, here we have a question by VJ. How do the constitutional arrangements of national devising policy and provinces responsible for service delivery affect what happens or not happens in the classroom? What would be a better solution, resolution? Okay, I think, Martin, I will hand over
Yeah,
to you
let's
now.
stop there.
Okay.
Last round, Martin, it is as long as you go.
Okay. Nikki's questions. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to school principals, I mean, a key contradiction, which again, this could warrant a PhD on its own, is the very complex accountability structures that surround principals. By law, principals are accountable to the department which employs them, but also, according to the South African Schools Act, to parents. Now, that can cause tensions that are still not fully resolved. I would say that that is probably the most difficult thing that principals deal with, different lines of accountability. It's worth noting that school principals have seen larger pay increases in the last 20 years than teachers. There was an improvement in the pay of principals relative to teachers, which in part was premised on this notion that principals will take certain responsibilities. I mean, it goes without saying that if you're a school principal, you do have additional responsibilities, and one must make it as easy as possible to fulfill those responsibilities. I can't see any schooling system succeeding without having a level of accountability from principals, and it's done in a lot of countries. What is not done is holding teachers kind of mechanistically accountable for what their children are learning, outside of a few experimental cases in some states in the US. But that is technically very difficult. Holding school principals accountable for what happens in the school, obviously in a fair way, with, you know, procedures and rules around how this whole thing works, that is far more doable. And I can't conceive of a schooling system tackling its inequalities of the kind we have without principal accountability being a key factor. And I think the South African School Principals Association probably would agree that accountability is important. And here's something that one might easily forget. Principals may want the clear, effective accountability lines from the department because it makes it easier for them to insist on accountability from teachers to them. Obviously, relatively informal accountability within the school, but as long as the principal doesn't have something to kind of turn back to, you know, principals need to say, look, the department is going to be on my neck unless these kids can read. Please, what can we do? That can actually assist principals in engaging with teachers in better ways, I think. And some examples of the rationalist steerers. I hadn't mentioned the institution of the Auditor General. Huge issue in government effectiveness in South Africa. In the last 10 years, the Auditor General's office, now the Auditor General's office consists of accountants, financial accountants. They've taken on the responsibility of performance monitoring across government departments. But the problem is that people who have studied financial accounting don't really know how educational outcomes or health outcomes work. So a lot of tension in government currently centers around the inability of Auditor General staff to get into the space of accountability for performance. Financial, obviously, they must deal with that. But when it comes to performance and non-financial indicators, should they be there or shouldn't they? It's interesting, the state of New South Wales in Australia basically pushed their Auditor General out of non-financial auditing. They said, this is not your space, it doesn't work. And I think they're good reasons for doing something like that. ECD, yes, obviously it's important. That wasn't the focus of the paper. I don't want to go into that right now. Accountability of parents, yes, and that of course brings up the question of not just parents being accountable, out of the blue, but what are the tools that the state provides to parents? So there are countries like Peru, which has seen spectacular improvements in reading amongst young children. One of the things they did was equip parents, local churches, indigenous organizations, etc., with little packs so that they could test children's reading and provide some basis for going back to the school and saying, look, we're concerned, these children can't read. Currently, parents in South Africa are under-equipped to really monitor whether their children are reading at the level that they should be reading. And yeah, finally, I think the input on Anna was more a comment than a question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think we've covered a lot of the, all, if not, yeah, we've covered all of the questions in the chat. There are definitely a few comments floating around, but I think we'll leave that for everyone to maybe read and engage with at a later time. I think we will land this seminar now. I want to firstly thank everyone for their patience. We are 15 minutes over time, so thank you for staying with us. And I think it goes to show how critical and relevant this discussion has been. And I think we could definitely go on for a few more hours. But we're not going to. So I just want to extend a massive thank you from ISER to Professor Gustafsson and Mr. David Fryer. Thank you so much for the very informative presentation, and also your very well-crafted response, David. I think it gave everyone a lot to think about, a lot of take-home messages, take-home points. So thank you very much for that. Yes, so thank you to everyone for joining us. Our seminar will be made available on the YouTube on the YouTube page as well. Yes, Prof.
So I just want to also say
Yes.
we're going to post this discussion on YouTube.
Yes.
So, you can continue there as well. Comments, Martin will send you a link to respond to ongoing questions and comments if there are any that you've missed here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Wonderful.
Okay,
So,
that's all. Yeah.
Yes. So this is my final thank you to everyone. Have a good afternoon. And yes, and thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you all at our next seminar. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, I'm glad the Dean of Education is here, joined